Planting your garden or getting your garden started for the first time can be a really big task, and it is a huge accomplishment. And even though I am all about keeping things as simple as possible and automating tasks whenever I can, there are still daily, weekly, and monthly tasks that need to happen in order for your garden to thrive all summer long. And so in today's show, I'm going to be covering all of the most important tasks to work on daily and weekly in order to have the most success this season. Hey there, I'm Audrey Crawford, and I am a California gardener in Zone 9. I teach you the tried and true methods of gardening in our climate and break down complicated gardening advice into simple and actionable steps so that you can grow your best garden yet this season. This is the Audrey's Little Farm Show. So as I mentioned in the intro, I like to keep things simple, and I really love to automate as many tasks as I possibly can. So I want to start off there because if there are tasks you can automate now earlier on in the season, that is going to really set you up for success. I just recently heard on a business podcast I was listening to this quote, and I can't remember exactly which podcast or who it came from, but it really stuck with me because it applies to every area of life. And that is that we can't add more hours to our day, but we can do things each day that might take more time in the moment, but will free up time in the future. It is truly the only way that we can add hours to our days. So think about that for just a minute. What are some tasks that you could work on in any area of life right now that might take you longer in the moment, which is why they've probably been pushed to the back burner, but that you know could save you time in the future? Here are a few great examples of how this applies to the garden. For example, you can set your garden up on irrigation and a timer. And you're going to do that once, and it's going to save you hours of watering for every future garden. You can put down mulch in your garden beds to suppress weeds and retain moisture, which means less time weeding and watering. You can put down gravel or bark in your walkways to suppress weeds. I prefer gravel in the walkways because it doesn't break down, but either is better than nothing. You can add lots of herbs and flowers throughout your garden to help deter pests and attract beneficial insects, which will help prevent pest issues in your garden. You can build trellises to grow plants vertically, which maximizes your space. It makes harvesting easier and creates more air circulation, which then prevents pest and disease issues. But all of these things, of all of these things, I would start with setting your garden up on irrigation and a timer. I realize that if you have a small garden, maybe watering is quick and easy, and maybe even something that you enjoy, which is great. But there is usually always a time for all of us, no matter how big or small our garden is, when we want to go out of town, or we have a long day at work, or it's just so hot outside we don't feel like watering. And when everything is set up on irrigation, we have the freedom to physically skip watering. And so if you're interested in getting your garden set up on irrigation for the first time, I have an entire course called Effortless Irrigation that will walk you through every step to make the process as simple as can be. So I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes. And since we are on the topic of watering already, let's talk about one of the first important tasks that you need to work on daily or weekly for a healthy garden this season, and that is to change your watering frequency as needed. One of the most common questions I get asked is how long to water my garden and how often to water. And the answer varies for everybody because there is not a one size fits all. It's going to depend on your soil type, the plants, the climate, the weather. There are so many things that go into it. So you have to learn your own soil. And truly, as long as you're testing your soil moisture, if your soil still feels moist, say, pretend I watered 24 hours ago and this morning I go out to water and the soil still feels moist, I can likely skip watering for today. But if it feels already partially dried out, then I should water. And ideally, you should be able to water every other day or every couple days if you have good soil that retains moisture, which is where mulch will really help. But anyways, watering is just always going to vary. And so, as a general overview, in the beginning of the season, when plants are young or when seedlings are just starting to grow or you're waiting for seeds to germinate, you need to water for shorter periods of time, but more frequently because you want to keep the soil moist, but not have it overly saturated. This top layer of soil needs to stay moist for seeds to germinate, and young seedlings have shallow roots. So that top layer of soil has to stay moist. But as plants mature, it's beneficial to water for a longer period of time and less frequently to encourage healthy, deep root systems. But then this also changes with the weather. So, for example, we had a really incredible month of May here in the Central Valley of California. We had very few hot days. They were just consistently mostly in the 70s and 80s, which is really great for that time of year. And so there was many days that I only watered a few times a week, sometimes only twice a week, and my plants thrived. However, as the temperatures started rising and I saw some higher temps in the forecast in the 90s and approaching the hundreds, I made sure that I was watering at least every other day to make sure my plants were well watered. But that is the really great thing about having a digital timer. I don't have to switch the timer. What I do when I don't have to water as frequently is I just set the timer to manual mode, which means I just press the button and it will automatically water for 5 to 10 minutes, however long I set it. And I just do that on the days that need watering. But then once the weather warms up and I know consistently my garden will need water, say every other day or every 2 days, possibly even daily, then I will set the timer so that it waters every day for that amount of time. So having the timer is just great because you don't have to turn on the hose and then remember to go turn it off. You just push a button. And so I have two different timers that I like. One has 2 zones and the other has 4 zones. So if you have a really large garden, the one with 4 zones is really great because you can set every area up on its own zone so that you retain high water pressure. And say you have one row of fruit trees, they need to be watered for a much longer period of time, but less often. So you can set that as its own schedule. And then if you have a flower bed that needs more or less watering, you can set that as its separate zone. It's just really great to split everything up. So check those out in the show notes as well. The next important gardening task to try to accomplish daily or at least weekly is weeding. And I know weeding is probably one of your least favorite tasks in the garden. I know it is for me. There's actually times when I somewhat enjoy weeding, especially if it has just rained or if the garden beds are nice and moist. But as weeds get large and out of control, or if the dirt is just hard and dry, it can get really difficult to get rid of all the weeds. But here are a few tips to make things easier. So first off, if you don't have very much time, start with the weeds that are growing near your plants. I often find myself knocking down big weeds around the perimeter of my garden that are not truly affecting the growth of the plants in my garden. For example, they're not competing for nutrients or water with my vegetables. They're just out on the outer edges where they don't look good, but they're not really hurting anything. And so if I only have minimal time to spend weeding, I need to start with the weeds that are actually affecting the growth of my plants. So start there. The next tip is to put down mulch. Mulch makes a huge difference when it comes to the amount of weeds that grow in your garden. I have some really long in-ground rows where I have some larger things planted like my tomatoes and artichokes and some berries, things like that. And there's 4 rows all next to each other, and 3 of the rows all have mulch right now. And then there's 1 row that I didn't need to plant anything yet this season in, and so I didn't put the mulch down. I used mulched up leaves out there, and I ran out of mulched up leaves, so I just left that row bare. And there are so many weeds in that row and very few in the 3 with the mulch. And it's just a clear sign of how well the mulch really helps to suppress weeds. And then the other tip is to not underestimate what just a few minutes per day can do. I know when you look around your garden and you look at the big picture and you see lots of weeds, it can be overwhelming. And if you're anything like me, you look at that task as something that has to be accomplished in just one day. And that's not the truth. If you just pull a couple weeds each day, before you know it, you're going to have much less of a weed problem. And the more often you pull weeds, they don't go to seed. You'll have less weeds in the future. So even if it's just 5 minutes per day, that can make such a huge difference in the end of your season. The next task to help your garden grow healthier this year is to support plants that need it. So, for example, tomatoes and cucumbers and tomatillos and things that sprawl or that get big and tend to fall over. It's really good to grow them along a trellis if possible, or use T-posts and wire to tie them up. We have all of our tomatoes growing along a cattle panel trellis. You can also just set up a single cattle panel with some T-posts, and that works great. I don't really like to use tomato cages for tomatoes because they're flimsy, and before you know it, the tomato plants outgrow the cage. However, tomato cages are pretty good for peppers. So there's a use for them, but as far as tomatoes go, I prefer either some T-posts and wire or a cattle panel or a cattle panel trellis, something that's much more sturdy. And then as you go through your garden each week, make sure to just tie up branches as needed. As your plants start growing, branches are going to fall over and touch the ground, which increases your risk for disease issues. And so tying up branches, keeping them up off the ground, that's a really great gardening practice. And it also makes harvesting much easier when your plants are growing vertically. And so I really like to grow things vertically and then, of course, just take the time to actually tie up the plants to whatever support you're using. And then the next tip during summer is to prune your plants sparingly. The thing with pruning your vegetables is that it's not truly required. You don't have to prune vegetables to have success. There's lots of different opinions on this, but your vegetables are going to grow wild and produce like crazy no matter what you do. Of course, all of this depends on the nutrients and the care that you're giving your plants, but you don't have to prune. But some pruning is really great for overall health. For example, I like to prune the bottom branches off of my tomato plants to keep them up off the soil, which prevents disease issues. But I don't like to prune off all of the suckers like you have probably seen in many videos before. There are lots of gardeners that like to prune off every sucker and just have one leading stem. However, here in zone 9, I don't like to do that because the more foliage you prune off means less foliage to protect your tomatoes. And we get really hot summers here. And so I want there to be lots of foliage to protect my tomatoes. And the more suckers you prune off means less fruit because every sucker produces another fruiting branch. And so for us, we really like to just get more tomatoes. And so the more suckers I keep, the more tomatoes we get. And then you can also prune squash and cucumbers. And with these plants, there's not so much of a technique as far as I just look at how the plants are growing. And for example, with a zucchini plant, if I have two zucchini plants next to each other and their leaves start overlapping, then I prune off those leaves that are overlapping because you want to keep airflow between those plants. If the plants start intermingling with each other, that just creates more pest and disease issues. So keeping the plants just somewhat cleaned up. I also prune off the bottom leaves that might be touching the soil. And then say you have cucumbers growing up a trellis, I will sporadically prune certain leaves just to create some more airflow so that you can, first of all, see your cucumbers better when it's time to harvest, but also just increasing that airflow decreases your pest and disease issues. The next important task is to harvest. And you might be laughing as I say that because, of course, everybody wants to harvest their fresh fruits and vegetables that they grew. But the thing is, we put so much work into growing our plants that once the fresh fruits and vegetables finally arrive, sometimes harvesting can feel like a challenge. I know for myself, if it's really hot, I don't want to be out in the garden harvesting. Or if I've had a long day, sometimes the thought of going out to harvest everything just seems overwhelming. And so make a plan to harvest every morning or every evening when the temperatures are cooler. And just make a point to check on your plants often because the more frequently you can harvest, the more productive your plants are going to be. And then there are certain crops that need to be harvested frequently because they grow so fast. So, for example, tomatoes are pretty slow to mature and they can be left on the vine for a few extra days and you're not going to have any issues. Same with peppers, they don't grow super fast. So, if you only harvest them, every few days as they're ripening, totally fine. And then the other thing with peppers is that certain varieties, like bell peppers, start off green and then they will ripen to red, orange, or yellow. And so if you are growing bell peppers and you're waiting for that orange bell pepper, it's not going to start off orange. It has to ripen to orange. So all your bell peppers are going to start off green and then eventually turn to the color that you want. So just be patient with those varieties. And then there's other varieties like jalapenos that will eventually turn red, but at that point, they are much hotter. So keep that in mind. If you don't want super hot jalapenos, you want to harvest them earlier on because the longer they stay on the vine and as they start turning red, they're going to be much hotter. And then as we get to things like herbs, the more frequently you harvest, the more productive your plants are going to be. It's also going to keep them from going to seed. So your basil, for example, if you don't harvest, it's going to start getting seeds on top of all of the leaves and you want to pinch those off or just harvest frequently. Even if you're not planning on using that herb that day, harvesting frequently will just keep your plant growing even better. And then the vegetables to really pay attention to are things like your okra, summer squash, and cucumbers. They can grow so fast. There are certain seasons when I could probably harvest twice a day. That's how fast they grow. And so to harvest them during their prime time, definitely check on them often and harvest frequently. The last important task is to observe. And I know this might seem obvious, but when we check on our garden frequently, we notice changes and we can take action quickly. For example, you might notice that there's a certain plant that's getting too much water or not enough water, or you notice a pest or disease issue right away and you can quickly take care of it. You might notice a plant is getting too much sun and needs some shade, or a vegetable or fruit is ready to harvest. So, as we notice these things, we can take the next steps before it's too late. So, frequently check on your garden, even if it's just a quick walkthrough every morning or evening. So, let's do a quick recap. We want to automate tasks, change our watering frequency as needed, weed often, mulch our garden beds, support plants when needed, prune sparingly, harvest often, and observe. And if we do all these things, we're going to have a really successful summer gardening season. So I hope these tips help you to have a really great summer garden. And if you'd like help staying on track in the garden throughout the entire year, I would love for you to join the Zone 9 Garden Club. We have such an incredible community, and each month I do an in-depth garden tour and teaching to help you grow a successful garden year-round. You can start a 14-day free trial, and that link will be in the show notes. And I just want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Audrey's Little Farm Show. I would really appreciate if you could rate or leave a review. It really helps other gardeners to find this show. And be sure to head to the show notes below, and I'll see you in the next episode.